August 24th, 1945. Joseph Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek signed a treaty 10 days ago between the Soviet Union and China. And on the surface of things, it's all good news for Chiang and retaining his hold on power. But considering how Stalin managed to install communist regimes in Eastern Europe recently, how much should Chiang trust Uncle Joe to keep his word? Very good question. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, Emperor Hirohito broadcast Japan's surrender, and the world, a lot of it, celebrated. But the war still wasn't actually over. For example, well over 1 million Soviet troops with several thousand tanks were invading Japanese-occupied Manchuria. I also mentioned last week that Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union and Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalist government signed a treaty with each other, which would seem to have sidelined the Chinese communists. When the war ended, it was difficult to find independent-minded people ready to proclaim Chiang's heroism or brilliance. No doubt millions of Chinese still lionized Chiang, still saw him as the symbol of the wartime refusal to surrender, as the man on the white horse brandishing that sword of patriotic defiance. But the public defection of the immensely prestigious Ma Ying-chu, of many of the country's other famous writers and scholars, and of thousands of restive students suggested a weakness at the core. And it was a weakness that the only other armed force in the country knew how to use to its advantage. The Japanese surrender came as something of a surprise to the Chinese, but of course it provoked great joy. There was a sobriety behind the joy though, because a lot of people realized that things hadn't been settled, and there might be another war looming, a civil war with Mao Zedong's communist forces. Chiang learns of the Japanese surrender when he's at dinner with the Mexican ambassador in Chongqing. He gives a radio speech about China's great victory and, perhaps surprisingly, asks the Chinese people to not exact vengeance from the hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops and civilians still in the country. He writes in his diary, "Everybody takes this as a day of glory. I alone feel great shame and sorrow." Why might that be? China was materially devastated, deeply divided, and backwards. The tremendous progress it had made in the 10 years of relatively stable Kuomintang government between 1927 and 1937 had been wiped out, except in Manchuria, which was soon to be systematically stripped of most of its industry by the Russians. Most of the railways were out of operation. Shipping was crippled. The roads were terrible. The bridges and tunnels wrecked. Farms were saddled with shortages of everything they needed. All over China, millions of refugees were without resources or work and faced with a roaring inflation that was making whatever money they had nearly worthless. The wheelbarrow had become the common conveyance for money because so much of it was needed. Chiang knows this well. He also knows that without the war with the Japanese, he would, in all likelihood, now lead a united nation with the communist threat long gone. Instead, they are possibly a greater threat to him and his vision of China than the Japanese were. 8 years of fighting, and at its end, a civil war might follow on its heels. American ambassador to China Patrick Hurley was unwittingly helpful to Joseph Stalin in his plan to expand his influence without making the Americans nervous. He met with Stalin in Moscow in April, and Stalin told him that the Soviets supported his efforts to achieve a negotiated compromise between the Chinese nationalists and communists. That sounded good to Hurley, but Stalin is well aware that Mao Zedong will not agree to anything that requires him to give up his army, and Chiang will not agree to anything that allows Mao to keep it. But Hurley didn't seem to notice Stalin's machinations in getting communists in power in Poland and Romania. So he never really has asked himself the question, why would Stalin do anything different in China? Especially considering that the Soviet press in 1945 tends to smear Chiang's government as reactionary, though that's who they have diplomatic ties with, and tends to praise Mao's, which they call democratic. Hurley also wrote to the State Department in July that the communists were too weak to take power in China, that their strength and support were all very much exaggerated. Hey, remember back at Yalta that the Americans had made concessions in China to the Soviets and had not told Chiang? Well, US President Harry Truman finally told him in July through Chiang's premier TV Sung. You can imagine how this makes Chiang feel, being sold out behind his back, but he knows he doesn't have much choice to agree. So he sent Soong to Moscow to basically agree to all the Yalta provisions, even knowing the risk of making a deal with Stalin, trading away Chinese territory for promises that may not be kept. At the final negotiating sessions between Stalin and Soong in Moscow, Stalin hinted that if the Chinese didn't sign the agreement on his terms and sign it right away, the result might be massive Soviet aid to the communists. Chiang figures that the deal, signed last week on the 14th, is maybe the only way to keep the Soviets neutral in the looming China fight. Stalin gets everything he wants: a naval base at Port Arthur, Dalian, control of the Manchurian railways, an independent Outer Mongolia, and in return, he recognizes Chiang's government, and only Chiang's government, as the Chinese government. The transfer, eventually, of Manchuria to China once the Soviet invasion is over, and no Soviet aid to the Chinese communists. Time magazine has this to say: "This kicked the props out from under the Chinese communists, who without hope of future help from their Soviet comrades might well be forced to surrender their separate army and administration and take their place as one of several political minorities in a unified China." Thing is, Mao is ready for action. The day after the Soviets invaded Manchuria, he ordered the new Fourth Army to concentrate main forces to occupy major cities and key strategic points. He even orders them to infiltrate thousands of troops into Shanghai to start a pro-communist uprising. This was preempted by Douglas MacArthur's order of the 15th that the Japanese could only surrender to the nationalists. Chiang also tells the anti-communist Okamura to use force if the communists do try to disarm the Japanese. But Joseph Stalin fully stops Mao's plan, which may have begun an immediate and violent civil war, by cabling Mao this week on the 21st and telling him to stop. Mao does. Stalin also tells him to go meet with Chiang, which Mao does. Liu Shaoxi, Mao's number 2 in many things, and supreme leader of communist forces in northern China and Manchuria, is in Moscow, and Stalin tells him that the Mao-Chiang meeting is a stalling tactic, and the talks will give the communists time to regroup and mobilize for coming battles. We shall see what happens soon enough. But coming battles in China? What about current battles in China? You know, the massive ongoing Soviet invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Well, the airfields at Harbin, Mukden, and Changchun are secured by aerial landings the 18th and 19th to prepare for securing Soviet gains on the Central Plains. On the 18th, the Soviet 36th Army overruns Japanese defenders at the Hailar Pass. The 20th, Soviet 35th Army finally takes the heavily fortified position of Hutao Fortress, using tank-supported assault groups to drive the Japanese into their concrete shelters and then killing them with explosive charges and ignited gasoline. Also, with small-scale amphibious attacks, they managed to break the stalemate on Sakhalin Island and have overrun it by tomorrow, the 25th. The Soviets assault the Kuril Islands from the 18th, and the Japanese surrender there the 23rd. The Japanese surrender is beginning to take effect. So the Soviets are also trying to prevent any evacuations to Japan from Korea. They occupy Wonsan the 21st and Pyongyang the 24th. All Japanese forces in the Korean peninsula north of the 38th parallel soon surrender. On the 22nd, the Soviets reach Port Arthur and Dalian. They occupy Port Arthur the following day, so they have now avenged the humiliating defeat there of 40 years ago in the Russo-Japanese War. And the week ends, and the war in Manchuria ends with an overwhelming Soviet victory. But as one fight is ending, another is getting going. Last week we saw the August Revolution begin in Vietnam. Now, on the 19th in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh take on an even larger role than they've had in gaining control of things. This happens at an unplanned, non-communist meeting. See, the Japanese are still in control of Indochina at the moment, through Bao Dai, who has been emperor of Vietnam since March. You'll remember that the French were finally expelled, and the empire declared then. This was forced by the Japanese, who made Vietnam part of their Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But last week on the 15th, the August Revolution began, and the Viet Minh's People's Revolutionary Committees started taking over administrative positions. Bao Dai goes along with this elevation of the Viet Minh the 19th because He thinks they're working with the American OSS, the intelligence agency, and could maybe guarantee true and permanent Vietnamese independence. So the Viet Minh take over Hanoi this day. Archimedes Patty, the OSS Indochina operations chief, already knows Ho Chi Minh and arrives in Hanoi with an OSS and a French military team midweek to liberate Allied POWs. He is shocked by the current revolutionary situation in Hanoi and thinks it might turn bloody, so he decides the OSS will give no further help to the Viet Minh, so Bao Dai is mistaken. In the actual fighting, the Battle of Thanh Nguyen lasts from this week on the 20th until tomorrow the 25th. The fighting is actually only sporadic, and it ends with the Japanese surrendering and agreeing to stay inside their fort. But there are plenty of people who are saying this particular event marks the liberation of Vietnam. There are several other uprisings this week, however. The Viet Minh consolidation of power is stronger in the north, where the communists have dominated the independence movement. The south is way more diverse politically and has big divisions in the independence movement under several rival factions. Still, today the 24th, the Viet Minh declare an administration in Saigon, a provisional one called the Southern Administrative Committee. But that's a much shakier proposition than control of the north. Also, already the 20th, Chiang Kai-shek orders the Chinese First Front Army to cross into Vietnam and accept the surrender of the Japanese 38th Army. It remains to be seen whether he is for or against the return of the French, which the other allies are for, south of the 16th parallel, where the nation was divided into two regions last month at Potsdam. And that brings me to the end of this week. With the war in Manchuria ending in the Soviets' favor, a revolution gathering steam in Vietnam, and deep worries in China that a bigger war than the one they just fought might be on the horizon. Oh, and on the 20th, Vidkun Quisling, president of the Nazi collaborationist government in Norway during the war, is put on trial. The prosecution calls for the death penalty. Also on the 20th, in the US, the War Production Board removes most of the manufacturing controls it has had in place. At the end of last week, actually, they removed restrictions on producing cars. Unlike any of the other major warring powers, the standard of living in the US has increased during the war. It will be interesting to see what living standards are like in the coming years in the lands of both the victors and the defeated. But still, Hirohito, the Japanese emperor, has yet to sign an instrument of surrender. I imagine they will quite soon, but what will that mean for places they currently occupy? The Soviets are in Manchuria. The Communist Chinese are in Manchuria. The Japanese are in Manchuria. Chiang Kai-shek's forces are not in Manchuria, not much at all in northeastern China. When the Japanese leave, what is going to happen up there? It seems to me that northeastern China is going to play a large part in things in the relatively near future. It also seems to me that should that happen, a lot of people will die. As I said at the beginning, this episode is dedicated by Time Ghost Army Brigadier John Belland to his grandfather Julius Poole. Julius was a poor farm boy from the Florida Panhandle who joined the Navy just after Pearl Harbor. A Great War veteran advised him to join the Navy over the Army, as that way you could avoid living in a foxhole or a trench. His first duty was running protection for convoys to the Soviet Union. He made several trips from Norfolk to Nova Scotia, from there escorting ships to Iceland and on to Scotland. He described the waters of the North Atlantic as the roughest he ever encountered, and he spent most of his time seasick. Combat-wise, the only major operation he served in was Operation Torch, where he was aboard USS New York, providing fire support for the landings at Rabat in French Morocco. He was very annoyed that the 14-inch guns turned his collection of saltine crackers to dust. Later, he spent the rest of the active war in both Key West and in Cuba, where he was put to work hunting U-boats on a sub-chaser. This meant long stretches at sea, broken up only by rolling the occasional depth charge over the side, without knowing if they'd hit anything. Julius was discharged in 1945 at the end of the war and moved to Colorado in 1948 with his wife Lomel to work in the oil fields. This paid $1.25 an hour, as opposed to the $1 a day his work in Florida paid. He raised his family in Colorado and died in 2015 at the age of 92. I will finish off today with John's closing words about his grandfather. He never talked much about the war when he was younger. The stories I heard were mostly those that focused on the lighter side of things, though I know that seeing the aftermath of the torch landings weighed on him. He remained one of the most optimistic people I know, always having a love for life and appreciation for the present moment. I think that this was a result of both growing up in Depression-era Florida and the effect of the war itself, which he always described as the biggest eye-opener the world ever saw. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.